Welcome to the first video for Unit 5 on cell division, or the life cycle of a cell. Now, what exactly is a cell life cycle? Well, every living organism on planet Earth has a life cycle, a series of recognizable changes and shifts and phases of development. And since cells are the basic unit of life, and they themselves can be considered alive, they also have a life cycle. We call this life cycle the cell cycle. Now, the cell cycle, very much in the same way that our bodies experience a life cycle, they're going to experience changes, and these changes and shifts and different events will all be controlled by various external and internal factors. Just in the same way that, when I was younger, I went from a child to an adult because of developmental changes that were triggered by internal factors. Our body's releasing different hormones, which cause different organs to start doing different things and different cells to do different functions. Each individual cell can also receive these internal and external factors, causing shifts or changes within the cell in the cell cycle. So, one thing we need to realize is that not every type of cell is going to experience the same cell cycle in the same way that not every living organism is going to have the same life cycle. So one of the major distinctions between cells would be prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Now, prokaryotic cells are ones with no nucleus and no membrane-bound organelles. Two examples of prokaryotic cells would be bacteria and archaea. So the bacteria and archaea, they have a life cycle, but it's very different from the eukaryotic life cycles that we're going to talk more about in the next couple of videos. Bacteria and archaea are asexual unicellular organisms, and so they have a unique set of phases or stages that they go through. Eukaryotic cells can be broken down into three other categories, especially if we're talking about the human body. We've got stem cells. Stem cells, they have the ability to change and to differentiate into other specialized types of cells. We got somatic cells, and these are the cells of our body. And whenever I hear this term somatic, it always makes me think of a sumo wrestler, right? So think of a sumo wrestler having a lot of somatic cells. They got big bodies. And then you've got the gametic cells. And the gametic cells are our gametes, sperm and eggs. These are sex cells, or cells that are very, very important for sexual reproduction. Now, bacteria and the prokaryotes are going to undergo something known as binary fission. So this is like an important part of their life cycle when the cell would divide, going from one organism and dividing into two. And so bacteria and archaea are going to undergo binary fission. Fission is division. And if we look over here at this diagram, here we've got a single bacterium. And we know that it's a prokaryote. Don't see any nucleus. I don't see any membrane-bound organelles, and I just see this quail of circular DNA in the middle. Now, remember, bacteria have circular chromosomes, or circular forms of DNA, as well as small plasmids, circular DNA that float around the cytoplasm. But anyway, if this cell is going to undergo a form of division, it first needs to make an identical copy of the DNA. So that way, if it's going to go from one cell to two, both of these new cells need to have their own copies of DNA. So the first thing would be to copy that circular DNA. And so we've got DNA replication. So we're making a duplicate copy. And for a while, it's going to be kind of a tangled mess in here. And then eventually the cytoplasm, the cell membrane, and cell wall will slowly start to divide. And maybe an equal number of ribosomes will be present over here as there are in this other cell. And then eventually, the cytoplasm and cell membrane will separate entirely. And what we'll have here are two daughter cells. And these daughter cells would be identical. They'd be exactly the same as one another, and they would be genetically identical. Their DNA will be exactly the same as the parent cell. And so you can kind of think about binary fission as a way in which bacteria clone themselves. And this has got a great deal of importance when discussing things like antibiotic resistance and why certain bacteria don't respond to medications anymore. But we'll talk more about that in greater detail when we get to our unit on natural selection. Stem cells, which are generally going to be eukaryotic, they're going to undergo something known as cell specialization. So their life cycle is quite complicated. They'll start out as a stem cell, and a stem cell is an undifferentiated or unspecialized cell. You can kind of think of a stem cell like just a blank canvas, or just a ball of clay, and that ball of clay is waiting to be turned into something, right? And so these stem cells, and there are a couple different kinds of stem cells, but we're not going to worry too much about that. And these stem cells, when they are given or when they are stimulated by internal or external cues or factors, they'll begin to change and they'll slowly become more and more specialized. So earlier on in our development as an individual, believe it or not, you started life as a single cell known as the zygote. And that zygote would eventually divide and divide and divide. And while it's dividing, it's making identical copies of itself. And then you end up with this embryo, this ball of cells. And every single one of those cells would have been more or less the exact same. Every single cell contains the exact same copy of DNA. They'd all look the same. They would all be performing the same functions. But then as it gets bigger, some of the cells will start to specialize. They'll start to change. They'll start to use different portions of the DNA to perform different functions, to make different proteins. And some of those cells may eventually differentiate or specialize into skin cells, where some become muscle, some become bone. And that process is known as cell specialization. And even as adult humans, we still have some adult stem cells in our bodies. And if you look in this diagram, you can see some of those being in our bone marrow. And some of those cells in our bone marrow have the ability to change into a lot of different kinds of cells. But that depends on the cues or the environmental factors that they are receiving. And when they receive different clues or cues, or when they're stimulated by different chemical compounds, maybe you just donated a bunch of blood and your body needs to replace your donated blood cells. And maybe there's a signal that your body releases, tells your bone marrow, hey, we need more blood. And then those adult blood stem cells could then specialize into your red blood cells, and then they could be released into your bloodstream. Or maybe you just came down with a pretty serious infection, and maybe your body needs more immune system cells. And so this blood stem cell would differentiate into a different type of cell depending on the need for your body. And they do this by expressing different genes. Every single cell in your body has the exact same copy of DNA. But what makes them different is what genes they're expressing. And remember, a gene is just a section, or almost like a chapter in the big book of DNA. And so this adult stem cell has all of the chapters. It has all the instructions to become any kind of cell associated with our blood. And if it gets a certain appropriate signal and says, okay, I need to become a red blood cell, it's only going to express those genes associated with the red blood cell. Whereas if it becomes a different kind of cell, it's going to express different genes. So all cells in your body have the same copy of DNA. They are simply expressing or reading different chapters. Now, the other type of cell type that we're going to talk about is the somatic or body cell. Human somatic cells are diploid or diploid, which means they have two complete sets of chromosomes, one from each parent. And so I have a set of chromosomes that I got from my mom and a set of chromosomes that I got from my father. And since humans have 23 different types of chromosomes, we can set up a little mathematical expression. If I got one chromosome of each type from each parent, I've got two parents. And there are 23 different types of human chromosomes, which means I, as a human being, should have 46 total chromosomes in my body. Now, the somatic life cycle, our body cells, the function really is to replace our damaged body cells or old body cells, and it occurs in three phases: interphase, mitosis, and cytokinesis. In the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about those phases that the somatic cells would experience during their cell cycle.